Welcome to the Family Office Success Podcast, where we explore the strategies, the insights, and the best practices that help families and their advisors build and manage successful family offices. I am your host, Christi Van Rite, and each episode, we dive into the key elements of running a family office. Whether you're a family looking to structure your advisory team for long-term success, or you're a professional managing the complexities of a multi-generational enterprise. From financial oversight and operational efficiency to selecting the right advisors and creating a lasting legacy, this podcast is here to provide practical guidance and expert perspectives. Let's get started. Hi, welcome back to the Family Office Success Podcast, where we talk all things family office. Today, we are having a conversation with Jeff Lambert with the LHT Consulting Group. Jeff and I have known each other, crossed paths for the last couple of years at various industry events, and I think what they do is incredibly important in service to our families. It just continues to build on our theme of how do we make things easier for the families that we serve and the generations between and across generations. So with that, Jeff, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Christy. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind, give us a little bit of information about your background and then what is it that LHT Consulting Group does?
Sure. Well, my background is I spent 24 years working in a single family office in various senior executive roles, chief financial officer, head of the operating group, included accounting and HR and things like that, for a large single family office in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So for about 10 of those years, one of my roles was co-leading the planning and ultimate execution of funeral events for our patriarch and matriarch. So that's how I got involved in this type of work. And in our planning processes, we were introduced to LHT Consulting Group when President Ford passed away. He is a native son of Grand Rapids, and when we were watching the events, we were early in our planning here and subsequently talked to the Ford family representatives, and they introduced us to LHT. So LHT Consulting Group does funeral planning and management for high net worth and notable individuals. They did our patriarch, matriarch, people like Billy Graham, Ross Perot. Those are names that we're allowed to talk about. Rich and Helen DeVos, my patriarch and matriarch here in Grand Rapids. But they also do the state funerals, and they got into this business when President Ronald Reagan died, and we were selected to handle those services. So out of that, we developed this business. We're a subsidiary of Service Corporation International, SCI, which is the largest funeral home company in the country. So it's a niche product for us, but one that we think is highly valuable.
I couldn't agree more. I teamed this up maybe a bit awkwardly. This is one of those things that families don't always like to talk about. It's a little bit challenging. It always comes up inside of estate planning conversations because, as everyone knows, we all ultimately hit the end of our time here, but it's hard to talk about. And so the importance, I'm quite sure you have seen over the years, as have I, of A, having a plan, but B, being willing to talk about it can really help a lot of families think through not only how to get to the other side, but also what do you want it to look like when that time comes, and how do you make it easier on the rest of the family and what is already going to be a challenging situation to transition the family into this next era without you there. And so from your perspective, why does this belong inside of the family conversations? Whether that's part of the estate planning or just having a conversation in general, from your perspective,
Right.
Why should a family have these conversations?
Good question and good way to start. I think this is a difficult conversation for everyone. I use our personal family as an example. My mother-in-law finally had to sit down and said, when are we going to talk about my funeral? Because we don't want to talk about it. We want people to live forever. We don't want to have these conversations rob the joy of life. And that's what it can feel like sometimes, I think, that we're trying to pull forward the inevitable. However, these can be incredibly fruitful and constructive conversations, particularly around obtaining people's wishes. We sometimes think we know, but we don't, or we may not, or there may be strong feelings one way or another. So, one of our points in all of this is how do you kind of naturalize this conversation? Make it so it's not so difficult. And as you pointed out, Christy, conversations already being had around this topic, maybe just not specifically about a funeral plan or a legacy plan. You're talking estate plans, you're talking about wealth transfer, all the things that are going to happen that aren't going to happen until a person passes in large part. But, this is just one of those additional pieces that can lead to actually very fruitful and engaging and I hate to say it, but enjoyable conversations about people's thoughts and legacy.
Yeah. It's interesting. We talk about all of the triggers in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't tend to go deeper in them, which is exactly where you fit in.
Right.
I think it's fairly clear, as you just stated, why a family should have these conversations. But have you found other things that have throughout your work and conversations with family that they were able to do the planning? And when the time came, when the trigger event happened,
Right.
that things weren't really well versus there was no planning because we didn't want to talk about it
Right.
and what the outcome of some of those look like
Right.
on the other side.
Right. Yeah, it really speaks to the importance of the planning. I think for notable individuals, high net worth individuals, the expectation of what these events will be like is elevated either by the community or the status of a family in a community. There's reputation
Yeah.
involved here. A lot of times we hear coming out of one of these that, oh, this event was very much what I would expect from the Smith family. Not that we're out to prove anything, but we want these things to be in line with what the family is used to and what they're used to presenting. And I think the expectations, particularly of those that perhaps may be politically involved, if city, state, national political figures come to these events, there's a whole
Mhm.
security aspect to it. There's a whole elevation of all of that. So we just find it's very important in these type of events or with these type of families to do this kind of planning because it really relieves the stress of the moment and it takes it out of a crisis situation where you've got to make a lot of big decisions in a hurry to something that can be done over time through conversation, through rumination on these things. For example, there may be some strong differences of opinion on what should be done or what was done for mom's service and do we want the same thing for dad's service and things like that. And going through the conversation early and in a non-crisis situation really gives you the opportunity to talk about those things and build a plan around it. And to your point, we see both sides. Those that are well-planned events, people ask us, oh, wow, that went really well. And we can say, well, that comes from years of planning. And I do say years because sometimes that's what it is because we don't know when the inevitable event will take place, right? So, we can start with a client and they can live for 10 years, and so we spend time from time to time updating plans, but they're all in place. And so when the event happens, you implement. Whereas a family that hasn't done this planning, an example that I have from hearing about was a family that I'm familiar with. Patriarch died unexpectedly. There was really no plan in place, and the brothers stayed up all night the first night arguing about who could come to the funeral, and looking over guest lists rather than spending the time, coalescing around family and celebrating life and grieving a passing. So, it's those type of things that you can really help eliminate by doing all this, and there's just a lot more to it as well as we talk about.
When would a family involve someone like you
Yeah. Yeah, it's
in the process?
yeah, really good question. We get that question all the time. Well, when's the right time to start, right? I mean, there's no magic answer to that. I think, if you have a, senior member of your family that is aging, I'd say into their 80s and 90s, certainly into their 90s, if there's not a plan in place, family office, family should spend some time thinking about that and developing plans. I would say, if you go back to someone in their 70s or earlier, you may not go to the same and probably wouldn't go to the same level of detail planning that you might do later on. But it's still
Mhm.
good to get the general understanding of a person's wishes. The chances are they've seen a parent's services or activities and they have things that they liked or disliked or want to think about for themselves, or they may have a spouse that feels like, we're part of this family, and I don't want to get overrun at the time of a funeral because of all the expectations of family. I want this to be more of a private event. So having the opportunity to do that, the earliest the stage, the better. There is no magic time, but I would say, certainly if somebody's in their 70s or 80s, it's probably a good time to start thinking about it. And certainly in their 90s, they probably ought to have a pretty good start to a plan. And then the other thing I would say, the families that we deal with oftentimes live what I would call extreme lifestyles. So they may be jumping out of helicopters, they may be skiing backwoods, jumping off of yachts, and the unfortunate side effect of that sometimes is an untimely demise, right? So having at least a framework of a plan in place can really help in those kind of very unfortunate and untimely situations.
That's a very good point. We do have a lot of adventure seekers in these families. So let's talk a little bit about that piece specifically. Maybe you are a younger family member, you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, whether you live an extreme lifestyle or perform extreme sports or not.
Right,
What are some of those high level things that maybe you should consider getting down on paper as a framework
right.
for the just in case?
I think a lot of these conversations actually, even before maybe we're brought in, is a conversation about permanent memorialization. Where does a person want to be married? What do they want to do with their remains? Is it a cemetery? They want to be cremated and shot into space. That oftentimes is where people start. They realize, oh, we don't have any plots anywhere. What do we want to do? So that's an important one. There's things that can be done with enough time. For example, we had a client that we started these conversations. He said, I really don't like our funeral plots, right? And so, we surveyed cemeteries in the area, and she didn't like any of those either. So what did we do? We built a private cemetery adjacent to a family home. So, with enough time and planning, you can do that early on. But more specific to your question, I think things like type of service that a person wants. There's kind of what we would think of as more traditional service where you may have, some scripture, some singing, 3 or 4 eulogies, and things like that, versus someone who doesn't want a lot of people speaking at their funeral. Maybe they've got some special music. Maybe they have a choir, or they're a supporter of the arts and there's a orchestra quartet that they want to have playing. Things like that can be very
Mhm.
helpful to have down. The permanent memorialization, whether they want a big open funeral or a very private family funeral. And how open are these events? Are they by invitation only? Are they open to the public? A lot of people have an interest, particularly in folks in this sphere that are big community supporters. They want to come out and support the family. Churches
Right.
sometimes don't allow for that type of attendance, so maybe it's a VIP. But I think anything around there's one client that I know really liked a writer, a particular writer, and he thought he would be excellent for writing his obituary. We would never know that if we didn't have those conversations, and having this conversation earlier gives that writer, if the family so chooses, the opportunity to talk with the individual. What's important to them? What do they want to be remembered for in an obituary versus, listing a bunch of rewards and recognitions, perhaps, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have absolutely been to services that felt incredibly curated
Mm-hmm.
and not in a, in a very thoughtful and loving way. And then I've been to services that it felt very much like the person that was giving the eulogy, the person that was really kind of spearheading the service didn't really know the person much at all, if at all. They were just getting stories from the family,
Right.
the day or two before when the family came and said, can you perform the service for us? And there is a difference, and I suspect everyone listening or watching has also had that same experience. And going back to your earlier comment that while a service like this can be very personal and should be very personal, a lot of times the families that we work with, there is sort of this inherent expectation of what it's going to be, especially if they are a prominent figure in the community or in their local community or in the business community. Those are definitely things to consider for sure.
Hmm.
So if you start working or when you start working with a family, what are some of the things that you go through with them, like the steps involved? How do you walk a family through
Right.
what is still going to be potentially on some level, a difficult conversation, even if they do realize that this can be beautiful? How do you walk a family through that?
We do have a structured approach that we take families through. We have a checklist, if you will, of what we feel like are the important topics to cover in a meeting. We don't have to cover all of them in a first meeting, but it gives a family an opportunity to think about some of these things in advance if they so choose, or otherwise we can have the conversation. But we can walk through the various components of what we would call a memorial event plan and just start checking them off. And what we find is there'll be things that in an initial conversation people have an opinion about, have a direction for, and then things they need to think about. And so, another benefit of planning is you give that opportunity for people to ruminate on what they might like and perhaps change their mind, if you will. So we take it through a checklist. What we find, Christy, is sometimes, particularly in family office situations, staff feels like, oh, I know the family member. We don't want to put you guys in front of them. Just give us your checklist and we'll get back to you, right? What we
Mhm.
find is sitting down with the principals themselves is an invaluable exercise, not only for the principals themselves, but also for family office staff as well as LHT consulting staff, because it really gives the principals an opportunity to talk about these things and why they're important perhaps, and our people that take them through are somewhat trained in how to bring some of that out, maybe take it to a next level of what you're looking for, why or why not. So what we find is, an hour or two of direct family meetings will save, family offices and families, up to a year in planning because you get that level of direction up front. So that first face-to-face meeting is invaluable. And from there you can tailor, additional follow-up items or sometimes what happens is you go in with this checklist and you say, we've covered these 3 or 5 things. What are the next 3 or 5 things we want to handle, or cover?
Right.
And you just, you check them off over time. And that, again, is a benefit of planning in advance because you can take your time. You don't have to feel like, oh, I got to make all these decisions today. And, funeral is happening in 2 days. And so, let's get going. So, really is an opportunity for conversation. And what you do find too is differences emerge, right? Even between perhaps spouses, or parents and next generation. And so, again, these conversations really help open up that dialogue so they can discuss those differences. And then at the time, everybody can look back and say, well, you know what? Sure, we can tweak a menu item over here, but you know what? Dad really wanted military honors. We're going to do military honors, So you kind of distinguish between the things that your principals really felt strongly about and maybe things that are what I would call more detail and what can be done later. But it really helpful to have the conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. And quite frankly, I know a lot of families with family offices that if you ask the family office a question, you would get one response. If you ask the family the question, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a different response, not because the family office doesn't know their family well, but just because they're looking at it through a different lens.
Right.
So I appreciate you making that point that even if there is a family office, just giving a checklist and going through it really doesn't get you all the way there. So if a family has done consulting with you and there is a plan in place, and from knowing you, I know that there is the ability for LHT to stay with a family through that and then actually execute
Mhm.
on those plans. So, what does that look like once the person has passed and now we're moving into actually having the service and
Mhm.
going through the plan? What does that look like? What is LHT's role in that?
Sure, sure. What I would say is, it's like strategic plans and other things like that. The plan is only good as the paper that it's printed on, right? So,
Very
the idea here is to capture the essence of what people want and as much of the detail as possible. So we want to, and we do provide plans that are incredibly detailed, down to the minute of what is going to happen throughout events. And so, although there may be a plan, I'll use our family as an example. The one I worked for, we had a timeline as an example that really took us over about 5 days of activities, right? Public activities were all planned for the second part of a week, if you will. Well, based on timing of when our family member passed, a whole different order made more sense. So even though we did all the events we planned for, they were in a very different order. And the
Mm.
benefit of the planning was we were able just to plug and play based on the family's desire and the calendar when the event happened. So what we do then at the time is we bring in a staff, we size that based on the need, how much staff a family or a family office or through vendors can provide, or perhaps a local funeral home. But we will bring in individuals, and we work with what we call the team leaders for each one of the events. So typically, someone's responsible for what's going to happen at the funeral event, someone's responsible for what's going to happen at the cemetery, someone's responsible for the invitations and the invite list. So, we act as quarterback working with all those individuals, reviewing what's been done, what's been decided, and then communicating with the family regularly throughout the process. Very important to keep the family informed of what's happening, as well as just get any updates or changes along the way. So the events occur. We typically do practice for those events. We do walkthroughs. You know, uh, if there's going to be a visitation, we're going to go to the site. We're going to make sure it's set up. We're going to make sure family, or we know where family's going to be, know where lines are going to be if we anticipate those. Same thing for a funeral service. We're going to practice with ushers. We're going to make sure those escorting or pallbearers on the casket know what to do and do it well at the time. There's nothing we want to leave to chance or those activities. So we're very involved at the time. And again, we're more than happy to work with trusted service providers of families. So, for example, florists, or if there's a local funeral home a family prefers, we can provide that. But we're also
Yeah.
happy to work with those vendors. But it's very important that you have a quarterback and a leadership team of people, driving that whole process.
Yeah. I would add, having been through this exact thing with one of our families, it is extremely helpful to have someone who's not specifically part of the family office who is leading these events. Because as the family office, once this person has passed, there's a whole host of other things that now, maybe not immediately, but pretty quickly, needs to get put in motion. And that's really where the family office can shine, is making that side of the work that much easier on the family. Having someone outside the family who knows exactly who to call, where things are, where and when things are going to happen, and who's facilitating all that, just takes a level of stress off that the family doesn't need on their shoulders at that point.
No, it's a really good
Um,
point. We're happy to play that role. We're going to go after all of this is over, right? I mean, we're available. We're happy to come back and work on other events. But you make a really good point. We can be, the bad guys if we need to. Not that somebody needs to be a bad guy, but we can do that. We're happy to play that role. Or if one shows up to the funeral that isn't invited, we're happy to take care of that so the family doesn't have to deal with that. So,
I have another question for you. For the advisors who are listening, or the other family office professionals who are listening to this can be from their perspective. Quite frankly, even for mine, working with families, it's a challenging topic to bring up. There are some easier entry points than others, like when you're doing your estate planning and your attorney is saying, so, need to know what you want here, or who's our bench for the trustee or whoever it is in the estate planning. But as an advisor, as a family office member, do you have some suggestions on how this topic can be brought up in a way that opens the door for a conversation to happen rather than a what could feel like a little bit more of a so you know you're going to die one day
Yeah,
and we need to know your wish.
right.
Like
Right.
you
I hear you.
yeah.
I hear you. I hear you. Yeah, it's a really, it's a sensitive topic. As I said,
Yeah.
it's challenging. I'm not the best at it with my own family, but it's a really important one. And I guess I'd turn that around, something for particularly family office executives to think about. One of the questions we like to ask them is, if your principal doesn't come down to breakfast tomorrow, what's your day going to be like if you don't have a plan? It's going to be very different if you do have a plan, because now you're calling in those that are involved, that know what to do, and you get it done, versus oftentimes what's going to happen is the family's going to turn to you as a family office executive and say, what do we do? Or what do you have in place? Tell us what to do.
Yeah. They're
So
going to assume something has been done because there is a family office.
right. So
Yeah.
and the reason I say that is there's no right way to have this conversation. I think you have to know your family members. You have to know how much you can say, what you can say. There's some more open to it than others. Some people are going to make more light of it than others. But I think, finding that moment, you mentioned the estate planning discussion. Maybe it's at the end of that where you say, hey, we've been through the financial aspects, but have you thought about how you want to be remembered? And don't talk about it so much of, where do you want to be buried, but how do you want to be remembered? What's the legacy you want to leave? What's important to you in how all these events may happen or occur? Have you given that any thought? And if you haven't, maybe you should. Let's set up a date to talk about that, if you're willing. And then, a lot of families need a little nudging on this. A lot of them will say, yeah, yeah, we need to do that, right? But they don't want to. There are a lot of things we need. There's a lot of things we need them to do that they don't want to do, right? And so,
Mhm.
we have to keep nudging them. And so this is another one of those. And I think if a family office executive is doing their job, this ought to be on their list of things that are really important to cover
Yeah.
with a family member, and then just keep finding ways to bring that up. You don't want to become a broken record about it, but it's an important topic, and if you feel like as a family office executive that this is important, you just got to find ways to talk to your family member about it.
Yeah. I wrote down the "How do you want to be remembered" line because in our family operations manual that we create for all of our families, it's kind of the roadmap for how we manage the business of the family. There is a section that says, do we have additional or do you have additional planning? And I've been trying to get at the question, have we talked about this? Is there anything in place? But your note of how do you want to be remembered? I am updating our family
Good.
operations manual to include that specific line because it really is that's a great opener. And I will tell you, our manuals are reviewed with our families annually. So I'm just thinking more on our side how we can be more proactive with the families that we serve in this capacity specifically to help keep it top of mind, but not on our monthly summaries. So, end of life planning. We
Right.
can talk about that yet? But yet keep it as part of the does this still look good? Does this still feel like what you would want to have? And or we still have this blank section in our manual. Can we set a time to talk about it? So thank you for that. Every time I talk to you, Jeff, I think of you give me new ideas and ways to talk about things. So thank you.
You're welcome. Call me
Yeah.
anytime. as a family office executive, I was a financial reporting guy. That's where I came out of. That's what I knew. I don't know funeral planning, right? And, same thing as a, wedding consultant. We're not wedding consultants, but we can put on a darn good wedding with the right consultant, right? And so to turn to a subject matter expert is, nothing foreign to the family office. So, why not use that in the funeral planning space? And, some of the reasons why I think that's important, there's things that are involved in this area. I was thinking of some of the things that, families might want to think about, whether or not they engage somebody like an LHT, but things that they might want to think about. Is a family member have a do not resuscitate directive in place? Our assumption may be that they do or they don't. And we might be surprised based on that answer. Is there a plan if a family member has an untimely demise overseas on a private aircraft, on a yacht? What's the family going to do? What's the family office going to do in those kind of situations? Are there medical plans in place for every location that the family visits regularly, vacation homes and things like that? So things a family office can be proactive about in doing. And so, I'll just leave you with this list of why for these families it's important. If you look at what a memorial plan ought to be, whether again you use an outside consultant to do it, but ought to cover things like, what is the communication when a person dies? When can a press release go out? Do all the family members need to be notified in advance? Do you have their phone numbers? Is there a speed dial for these folks? What's going to happen with the remains? Do you have a funeral home picked out? Who's going to pick out the funeral clothing? Who's going to pick out the jewelry? The casket selection, things like that. Timelines for all the events and processes. A lot needs to go on, notification, getting RSVPs, things like that. Guest lists, invitations, credentialing, seating plans at a church, handling VIPs, security, the media, is there a media presence you want to do? Site schematics and documentation, service components, we talked about that. What do they want their funeral service to be? Even things like transportation for the family. Are they going to drive their own cars? Do they want to be in sprinters so that families arrive on time and together? Are those available in the location where you might be? Final disposition and permanent memorialization we talked about. So, doing one of these well is a pretty detailed activity, and we just encourage families to really focus on it because one of the best comments that we can receive and have received from families is that when all of this is over and they've been through it, is they say, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because of your work, we were able to spend time as a family celebrating our loved one's life, grieving their loss, and knowing that the details were handled. That's what they expect in the rest of their life, and it's super helpful at this critical moment in a family's transition.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Jeff, thank you. We are going to link to the LHT website in the show notes and your LinkedIn and email, if that's okay. So folks can get in touch with you directly if they are interested in learning more about what this service can do for their families. So thank you very much for being here, Jeff. I sincerely appreciate your time with us today. And as always, look forward to seeing you again soon.
Good. Thank you very much, Chrissy. I appreciate it. Have a great day and a good summer.
You as well.
Thank you for joining me today on the Family Office Success Podcast. I hope you found this conversation insightful and valuable as you navigate the complexities of family office services. If you're looking for more ideas or resources or want to explore how we can support your family office or your family through services and training and strategy, connect with me on LinkedIn or visit our website at whiteriverconsultants.com, and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and expert insights. And if you're ready to take your family office to the next level, consider joining our mastermind where we can help you manage that chaos and create better outcomes for the families you serve. Until next time, I'm Christi Van Rite, and this has been the Family Office Success Podcast. Take care and keep building for the future.